lived in the Sermon on the Mount for 45 years and had the arrogance to believe that I knew it all until this paper. And I realized I had missed something very important, and I want to share that with you. I have never experienced persecution, so I'm looking at it in an inherently limited perspective, and that probably explains why I didn't notice this before, because I lived in the privileged side of it. So I have 4 sections of the paper. One is guiding assumptions. These are things I am quite sure of. The second section is called persecution, the reality of resistance to the empire of heaven. And that was a new section for me. The third section, is reinforcing resilience, and that's where I'm wanting to go. Rereading Matthew for resources. And the final one is to say, what happens if we look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, and the book of Matthew through the lens of persecution? So going back to the beginning quickly, I argue vigorously that Matthew is a manual for mission. That's its fundamental identity. And I give you in the paper my reasons for saying so. And secondly, moving down to point 2, there's times. Matthew likes doubles, things are confirmed by the witness of 2. So John the Baptist and Jesus have the same fundamental message. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And that is not to be taken lightly. That's the foundation of the book in many ways. How you develop it with the Sermon on the Mount, including the Beatitudes, which I have very strong conviction, some of you know, and the pregnant community identities as salt of the earth and light of the world. And the 5 antitheses. These are case studies that in my judgment, illustrate what Matthew has in mind for us to understand when Jesus talks about, let your light so shine before others, that they may see your good works. Matthew is not going to leave us to guess. Chapter 5 develops with that quite closely. And then in part C, the itinerants, the missionaries of the 12, they come announcing the empire of heaven. Now, I've chosen the word empire, thank you, Keith, to remind me when there was not a kingdom, Rome was an empire. Babylon was an empire. And the same language that's used, I'm choosing to use that word. It's a little bit more arrogant sounding, but it suggests something of the size of the invasion that's facing the Roman Empire. And it's interesting that in chapter 10, which is announcing, you have a huge amount of material, but I want to point out that it's followed in initial instructions by instructing those who respond and declare their allegiance to the empire of heaven. And we see that at the end. And there are 2 groups, the initial apostles and then those who believe. And both of them are dealt with in Matthew and have somewhat different roles when it relates to persecution. We see 2 audiences at the time of the Sermon on the Mount. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And at the end, it's fascinating, he notices very last words in Matthew 7, 28 and 29. The crowd is amazed at Jesus' words, for he was teaching them. So both audiences were present at that time. We notice that Jesus first sends out the 12 disciples, and he also calls them the 12 apostles in 10:1-4, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, where they're going to expand the range of Jesus' reach and imitate his itinerant teaching, healing, and preaching of the gospel of the kingdom. Even the designation, the 12 apostles, evokes those promises of God to reconvene the scattered tribes. So the 12 carry them a kind of weight, as known as the 12. Text there in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Amos all refer to the restoration of the 12 tribes. And of course, Jesus says to his disciples that they will sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes. So that's important. What about those who respond to the apostles' call? Let's face it, the vast majority of converts to the empire of heaven am I talking too loud? No, okay. out of necessity, continued to live in their villages and urban apartments. But now they too have become part of the light of the world. They're described as the city. Cities don't move, city on a hill. They're called to bear witness through their highly visible good works to the reality and character of your, plural, Father who is in heaven, resulting to those witnessing their good works, praising that Father who's in heaven. And I think the remainder of the Sermon on the Mount provides assurances and warnings to these resident clusters of converts. Second section, persecution. This was new to me. The dangers following Jesus' followers involve more than persecution. There are other dangers, internal strife, wolves in sheep's clothing, and so forth. But what's striking, the anticipated dangers from persecution accompanying the expansion of the mission show up very early. Now, typically, in a series of items, the last item is significant. It's the one you remember. It's the climax. And would you note with me, persecution is highlighted in the dominant position of the final beatitude. And it is also expanded and personalized. Almost as many words in the Greek on that persecution are out for the other 7 beatitudes. And the persecution there takes the form of insult, uttering evil. In other words, understanding that they shall, the explanatory accompanying words with the word persecution, they give us an idea. It's essentially verbal, amounting to the destruction of reputation and allegations, impossible to quash in a culture centered on honor. And think of the implications for social displacement, exclusion, financial loss. Even groundless allegations lay the groundwork for severe reprisals. However, the communities invested in the empire of heaven are urged, don't hide your identity, but let your light so shine. Lamps light the whole room. I think we're dealing with more than modesty here. The threat of hostile reception and persecution are much more likely the reason for the temptation to stay out of the limelight. Jesus notes that the attempts to hide the light, or the light to hide, are futile. City on a hill can't happen. And efforts to hide one's loyalty from neighbors in multi-story apartments that comprise the majority of urban housing, and even from one family members, would likely be impossible. And if you look to chapter 39, Jesus goes in some description how his mission will break up family ties, father and son, mother-daughter, and daughter-in-law. Even stronger is the prospect of family members putting one another to death because of loyalty to Jesus and the empire of God. We notice as missing husband and wife there. That's another whole subject. And then look at the antitheses themselves in the rest of chapter 5. There's 6 of them. What's the last one? The most important thing Jesus said for our generation: love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. He puts that in the dominant spot. And this seems to me to suggest that this act of persecution was a reality. And then you find persecution going all the way through the mission instructions. It's mainly about coping with persecution. From verses 16 to 39, the overwhelming focus is on persecution. And if you compare Luke's discourse in chapter 21 and Mark in 13 and Matthew 24 and 25, what you don't see in Matthew 24 and 25 that you see in the others is some of the most intense forms of persecution mentioned. Matthew shifts it back into that mission discourse. It's current in his thinking. That's fascinating to notice. So this, I think, in chapter 10 is focused on the missionary, not the resident believer, but the one who goes out. They are expected to be facing all kinds of persecution, and they're supposed to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And when they are persecuted, to run away, unlike the city on the hill. Okay, so martyrdom is not sought in chapter 10. They can expect hostile legal action, physical torture, loss of life. And you think of automatically of Paul's description in Acts and 2 Corinthians 11. And then going to chapter 13, there's that collation of parables about the reception of the kingdom, how it will be received and so forth. The specter of persecution arises in the parable of the four soils. Oh dear, really? Can somebody hold the clock? Wow, okay. Wow, okay. I'll move to looking at F there. We'll notice that in F, that what Mark has done in his long list, he has one item slander. What Matthew does is rearranges the whole thing out of the mouth and then false witness and slander. Let's go down to section 3. Anyone who wanted to follow Jesus was to take up his cross and follow me. And both Jesus and John are executed. And I think in chapter 5, you also have a circle of support, which is found there when you have a communal setting. And also the Beatitudes set forth reassurances. What's doing what's right? Placement in heaven, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And when Matthew talks about righteousness, he's probably talking about good works that we see in that chapter and not traditional righteousness in chapter 6. And then the D, the future reward for enduring persecution is so great that the only response for persecution is for the community to rejoice. It's a communal rejoicing. That's fascinating. A festive realignment. And then you also notice that any attempt to shame or diminish them, Matthew reminds them they're standing right up there with the prophets. So again, identity placed high because of that. And then we notice too that there's a shift from empire of heaven to your Father in heaven. You have the communal relationships we see throughout chapter 5 and 6. Your heavenly Father knows you need them all. So you get that sense of community in the Father who counts. And of course, I'm skipping a couple of things here. I'm going back to section 4, looking at the last part here, and thinking of what I'm trying to propose to you to think about. It seems to be quite clear that when you read the antitheses in chapter 5, by and large, they can be characterized by assertive and often creative. Assertive and creative, love. Assertive and creative. So the response to evil is not acquiescence, it's not revenge. It's a response that transcends, that goes beyond what would be expected. So you walk the second mile. What a crazy idea. Turn the other cheek. Take off all your clothes. I mean, this kind of attention to how to respond to evil doing invites the creative mind of the community to not only respond, but to respond in such ways that might be out of the box. And I think there's a higher purpose than mere survival. I'll put it this way. The persecuted acts as agents of your Father who's in heaven. Hostile behavior becomes the occasion for an assertive and often creative response of love, letting your light shine in such a way that others will see your good works and purpose. And then ultimately, I'll stop on J. I think I'm probably close to time. Assured of the Father's immediate and ultimate care, which is important, the community of light rises above revenge, even reaching the height of prayer for the well-being of the persecutors, whether materially or spiritually. Thus, the community's creative responses to persecution reveal the character of your Father who's in heaven and fulfill the command, you must be perfect, mature, fully developed moral sense, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, 5 down there with a widening circle give you some other possibilities, and I would like to work on them. But anyway, thank you for the opportunity to do so. I learned something new. Thank you for this assignment.